It's Friday, Feedback Friday, the feedbackiest day of the week. It's Feedback Friday. Spiffy new Feedback Friday opening done by the wonderful Eileen. And you will notice Momo has a megaphone. Eileen, I can't say enough about Eileen's graphic work. Please, if you want to hire Eileen, let me know. I will put you in touch. She is Eileen on Twitter. But she is fabutabulous. And that's going to look even better eventually. I'm not the whiz with Illustrator she is, so there's something I have to fix, but I wanted to make sure we had it this week because it's spiffy. And these sorts of things make me happy. It doesn't take much to make me happy. You may have noticed. But the feedback this week made me happy for the most part. There were some people that just picked at tangents, and I'm not going to bother with that because that's the sort of behavior I don't want to reward. When people start reading weird, nefarious intent into offhanded side comments I make, not worth my time, not worth addressing. I did ban one person for attacking someone based on sexuality. We don't do that here. I don't care what the pretense is. We don't do that here. It doesn't matter whether someone is gay, straight, bi, pan, anything like that does not matter. Irrelevant to topics like, say, COVID or Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan was one tangent because it wasn't really a tangent. It was part of the meat of the discussion. And I am going to address some of the comments on Joe Rogan because I found the discussion interesting. I find the people who are huge fans of Joe Rogan very interesting to proverbial listen to in comments, because I will be totally candid here. I am not a Joe Rogan fan. I have listened to the Joe Rogan podcast 3 times. It felt every single time like an exercise in feeling my IQ drop while I was, and I know that doesn't happen. It's a figure of speech, but I felt dumber for the experience every time I listened to the podcast. But that's me, right? The rest of this YouTube video may explain why Joe Rogan's just not at my level, because we're going to do a deep dive into some things. But the very fact that I don't get Joe Rogan is why I think it's important to pay attention to the comments of people who do get Joe Rogan. And some people are very passionate about Joe Rogan. It seems like one of the things that recommends him is that he can say stuff that's contentious and not get canceled. I would add a yet. But I understand the emotional attachment to that kind of thing. I will accept that point. I actually went and looked into what the comments actually were on his podcast, what was said, what wasn't said, what was kind of exaggerated by the media, what dumbass shit he actually did say at times. But yeah, it was interesting. I sat with it a lot, but at the end of the day, I still think that a guy who gets 11 million clicks a week in a country of, spitballing population of the US is 330 million people, this does not a normalized opinion make. And okay, normalized for the internet, maybe, but not even. It's just a butthead guy who shoots the shit with a bunch of different guests every week. Unless people are tuning in to confirm their own biases, I don't see the harm other than the headache some of the idiocy he says gives me. But again, I don't like the Joe Rogan podcast. Therefore, I don't listen regularly to the Joe Rogan podcast. That's how these things work. But the whole normalization thing, as one commenter put it, you can't look at it as just the Joe Rogan experience. Just the Joe Rogan podcast, or just, conservative talk radio, or just a bunch of the things that are going on the left. You can't look at one CW show in isolation. You have to look at kind of what's going on in media with general trends to really get at the core of what we're officially now calling the Normalization Wars. Because I think that sounds cool and like something that would come out of an Expanse novel, or some other sci-fi that I'm a big fan of. Like, I could see somebody dropping Normalization Wars in like another season of Killjoys that happens in my mind. But the Normalization Wars, like it's like the Borg, but also like the Psychor from Babylon 5, but it is just so perfect science fiction, and for some odd reason that makes me happy right now. It doesn't take much to make me happy these days. You will notice a trend. But I do want to get into this idea of normalization so people understand it more. And this involves diving in to the wild and wonderful brain of a philosopher that I struggle with in delightful ways, Michel Foucault. Because Foucault, when I'm being more of an asshole, it's like, dude was on crack. But it is amazing how much stuff he sort of had insight into, because in many ways because of his unique biography. And normalization is one of those things. It comes from his work Discipline and Punish from 1975. If that sounds kind of kinky, you'd be right. It's Foucault. But so this is what he actually said in a lecture in 1978 about the idea of normalization. And this is like so much philosophy, circular and dense, and at first you're like, but what did that actually say? Anything meaningful? So I will read the quote, that I will break it down for you. So we'll go from like Foucault to somewhere between Foucault and the intellectual level of the Joe Rogan podcast, okay? Because this is how we roll. So what Foucault defined normalization is normalization consists, first of all, in positing a model, an optimal model that is constructed in terms of a certain result. And the operation of disciplinary normalization consists in trying to get people, movements, and actions to conform to this model. The normal being precisely that which can conform to this norm, and the abnormal that which is capable. That which is incapable of conforming to the norm. Sorry, when you translate from the French, it gets a bit goofy. In other words, it is not the normal and the abnormal that is fundamental and primary in disciplinary normalization. It is the norm. That is, there is an originally prescriptive character of the norm, and the determination and identification of the normal and the abnormal becomes possible in relation to this posited norm. Now, people may be more familiar with the Platonic ideal of the chair, like the idea of a Platonic ideal, that there is this perfected, abstract, and not real idea of a table, a chair, an apple. But the minute you take a tangible chair, table, apple, they take on unique characteristics and fall away from the ideal. What Foucault did with that is no, we're not dealing with ideals anymore. We're dealing with norms. And basically what Foucault said in the necessarily circular, wordy, and dense construction of philosophy is that we cannot have the concept of normal. We cannot have the concept of abnormal without the norm, which, is the compare and contrast hinge point, right? And this is where Leanna gets very, very wonky. And I reject the idea of normal whenever I do anything remotely academic. I avoid the word normal like the plague, precisely because I have read Foucault and all his weird and wonderful kinks. There is a big difference between the idea of typical and normal, right? Typical is just, is it common, right? Normal is different. And that's what Foucault was saying. There is just an observation in the term typical. Do more people do this than not? All right, then it's typical behavior, right? But normal suggests something more moral at its core, or more foundational at its core. Because think about it. Atypical, abnormal. Abnormal carries much more of a charge, right? And it is something of an abstraction why abnormal carries much more of a charge than atypical. But it does. And so whenever I do talks about gender, whenever I do talks about anything involving people in a remotely academic setting, it's always typical and atypical, not normal. Why? Well, because the minute norms become oppressive in modern parlance, or as Foucault would say, disciplinary, they start dictating who gets to belong. When you use the idea of typicality, which when it comes to gendered behavior is very important, because we have this idea of, gender norms. Just as an example, because this is one of the things I teach. 25% of the population is not sex typical in terms of interests and preferences and how their brains work. I am certainly not. There were people fighting in the comments about what that means in this video, and anybody that's watched my content for any length of time knows I reject this entire premise that there's something meaningful to not being sex typical. Why? Because a quarter of the population is a massive minority. And we're supposed to be in a post-enlightenment phase where rights of the minority matter. But that has been so warped by propaganda like the moral majority. The moral majority is a euphemism for a minority that thinks they're right. And that was started by the right and picked up by the left. And then the left got done with it. And so the right took it back and weaponized it. And now we have the normalization wars, right? Just saying an idea is not typical, a position is not typical, puts no moral burden on it. Saying something isn't normal does, in a meaningful way that I think we all understand, but defining it is difficult, and that's why Foucault had to do like this 3-line blah 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 norms and normal and abnormal, right? Because there is no there is no norm in typicality. There is no idealized abstract concept, right? It is just observation of what the majority thinks and what the minority thinks, and the majority is typical and the minority is atypical. There is no linchpin piece. There is no keystone in that, the way the concept of normal has. And this is very powerful when you start influencing people's thinking. Because look at the two models, right? Typical and atypical is, all right, three people think one thing, one person thinks another, but hey, that's cool. We can all get along. We accept difference. That's one model. That's the typicality model. The normalcy model, it very much, because there is this thing, this norm that everybody is comparing themselves to, all of a sudden, normal is better than abnormal instead of just being more common or frequent. You see what I'm saying? It's a completely different mindset. And this is why when we get into the blah, blah academia, of heteronormativity or cisnormativity or, normativity based on a particular race, all these fights happen. And it's really interesting to me to have watched, particularly progressive academia, going from railing against the entire idea of normativity, right? The idea that being straight is normal and being gay is abnormal, or being anything but straight is abnormal. See, there's an example of a norm that became powerful in a way that was counterfactual. If you believe sort of the Kinsey scale or anything like that, you believe that theory where most people exist on a spectrum of sexuality somewhere between completely gay and completely straight. So making being straight a norm, well, it's not. It's an artificial norm. It's not normal in the idea that it is the most common thing. Somebody decided, boom, being 100% heterosexual is the norm and everything else is freaky weird, right? That's how it works. And it's interesting, the fact that progressive academia and progressive media have gone from trying to rail against the idea of norms to trying to control norms through this culture war, the normalization war, right? This is where all the craziness online comes from. Instead of rejecting the idea of normalcy as a not useful, unhelpful concept and being more open-minded in the idea that just because we don't consider something normal doesn't mean it's bad, right-wing activists and even right-wing academics are trying to skew normal instead of rejecting normal. And skewing normal doesn't solve the problem, because as long as there's that disciplinary norm that Foucault talked about, and what that means is that there is a norm. If you are normal, okay. If you are abnormal, you are punished for being abnormal. That's what a disciplinary norm means. And this is what's going on with the normalization wars. This is what's going on in culture. Some subsection of the population sets a norm, enforces that, and disciplines abnormalities. Now, in this system, it does not matter what the norm is. It is a race to the bottom, because fear of punishment, fear of discipline stops us from critical thought. where the whole idea of, great philosophers drink hemlock other than submit. I'm not sure that's better. It's just a different extreme, but that's the whole idea, the whole give me liberty or give me death thing. The one thing any oppressive state should not be able to do to an individual is control what goes on in that individual's own mind. And that is exactly what the normalization wars are trying to do. Right-wing actors and left-wing actors are trying to pull the idea of normal their way. And they've shattered the Overton window. There's so many disparate normals that's why people are at the point where nothing can just be an no big deal. Everything becomes a potential normality setter. Everything potentially becomes a norm, right? Because we see, the left yanks some content or cancels some speaker because of wrongthink, and then the right goes, oh yeah, we're going to take over school boards and do way worse to way more things based on spite and an arbitrary, we don't like it, it's weird, therefore it goes. And we're observing this, right? But the way to combat it isn't to fight based on norms. It's to reject the entire concept of norms. It's to be the Punisher in the comic book version of Marvel Civil War, which people are like, that's not the movie. No, it's not the movie. The only thing that the comic books have to do with the movie Civil War is the name. But my favorite part of Civil War is I think Punisher ended up with the Steve Rogers camp just because they'd take him. And there's this one moment where he's like, everybody else is like, rah, rah, rah. And he's like, no, I think you're stupid too. I think both sides are stupid. I reject this entire thing. I think you're all wrong. I'm paraphrasing. But I was just like, yes, because he became my proxy in the story at this point. Because the whole time Civil War was going on, I was like, what the fuck are all of you people doing? This is a stupid conflict. You are choosing this binary thing because reasons. Punisher is right. That's the only way out of it. And of course, spoiler alert, the eventual resolution that a lot of people found unsatisfying is Steve Rogers finally decided he wasn't going to fight anymore and just walked away, which didn't work because of the way they set it up as well as I think they thought it would. But good try in terms of rejecting the idea of a binary conflict. It takes two sides to fight. But when we're talking about norms, right, as long as we accept the idea of norms, we do have to fight in a binary framework because there's normal and abnormal. And so everybody's fighting to control the norm. So they get to set what normal is. Is it some sort of weird mythologized conservative fever dream of American history? Or is it critical race theory? There's no in between because those are the two factions fighting over norms, right? As opposed to rejecting the entire idea of disciplinary norms. Norms that if you stray, if you are abnormal, you get punished. I think there's a lot of people probably going nod, nod, nod right now. Yes, this has been their experience for the last 10 years, that increasingly there are very rigid disciplinary norms and they are punished for not being in line with them. Now, the problem is that the norms are going back and forth like the fucking playable ship in Space Invaders or Galaga or some shit like that. Nobody actually knows where the norm is because it shifts so rapidly because of these fucking normalization wars, pulling it all over the place, shattering the Overton window. Because the Overton window is essentially a mean of popular opinion, right? It's possible to exist someone outside of the Overton window in the Overton window model without essentially being canceled. In the Normalcy Wars, it's not. You have to be normal or you are punished. And that's what Foucault was talking about. The only way out is to reject the entire premise, which is what I'm doing with the whole Joe Rogan thing. That Joe Rogan is influential enough to matter this much. He's able to set normal with 11 million subscribers in a population of 330 million people. Like, when you lay the numbers out like that, it sounds absurd, right? But people seriously believe this. I mean, okay, it was explained to me by one person that Neil Young and Joni Mitchell are both polio survivors. So this is near and dear to their hearts. And the thing is, if Neil Young and Joni Mitchell want to pull their music from Spotify as a principled stance, I respect that. Does that mean in their position I would do the same thing? Does that mean they are more moral than what, say, Meghan and Harry did, which was keep their content on Spotify but express concerns? Breanne Brown apparently temporarily paused new episodes of her podcast out of concern. Is any one of these things the norm, or is doing nothing the norm? Or are all of these equally moral stances with just people expressing their conscience, and we give people the right to do what lets them sleep at night? I much prefer that world, right? Now, they're putting advisories on the Joe Rogan podcast. I don't know how much that is going to do, because I don't know how many people are going there for confirmation bias on ivermectin, are going to click a link and read boring crap about the facts about COVID. They're already living in magical thinking. They're already mind-wormed by the normalization wars, because the whole point of seeking out confirmation bias is that you want to believe that your opinion is normal and therefore okay. When you're someone like me who does moderate doses of content that either makes me feel like my IQ is dropping, or I've just been subjected to the ravings of an utterly insane person that for some odd reason has been, nominated subject expert of the week. I subject myself to that because I reject the idea of punitive norms, of disciplinary norms. I want a diversity of opinion. I believe in the marketplace of ideas. I mean, up here in Canada, we're dealing with, this whole trucker thing. And I think the rest of the world is kind of befuddled by the way it's being handled. And there are a lot of idiosyncrasies about Canada in that one. I did a little thing for the patrons in case they cared about understanding it, but there's no time to get into that now. It's just a microcosm of Canada that everybody's sort of like, well, you got to let people by, guys. Like, we don't want violence. And so we're going to choose annoying over violent. And a lot of people don't know what to make of that. We'll see how it plays out. But that whole convoy is every time there is a protest like that, every time there is an act of aggressive civil disobedience, not nonviolent civil disobedience. I don't classify the trucker convoy as peaceful. They threw things at paramedics and, defaced war memorials. That ain't cool. And you can say, but other protests. Yes, any protest that stops being peaceful Like the shit went down in, Kenosha, Wisconsin. That after dark, that wasn't peaceful. Literal flaming dumpsters, not peaceful. We can all agree on that, hopefully. But, that is an attempt to prove a fallacy that a couple thousand people in Ottawa are the majority opinion, and we have so much support, and that means we're right. It's a movement. No. And I mean, Trudeau, like him or not, came out and actually made an argument based on reason. He said, we just had an election where vaccine mandates were an election issue. COVID health mandates were an election issue. And 70% of people who voted for a party with a pro-mandate stance. This is how we're going to govern. This is what we're going to govern based on, not some obnoxious people who may or may not own Mack trucks, right? They own big wheels, doesn't make them more right. That's logic. And, Trudeau's other failings aside, it's nice to hear a politician actually argue from a position of reason there. Because there's an example of him actually going, no, we have a majority opinion here, right? 70% of people who cared enough to vote voted in favor of this. This is how representative democracy is supposed to work. This isn't, we're going to fake normal with 1,000 people out of a country of, I think Canada's like 38 million or something right now, or 11 million Spotify subscribers versus 330 plus million people. Like, these are not norms. These are not norms. These are false norms. This is forcing the Foucault model of the norm so that you can sort people into the people who get punished and the people who don't. And that was Foucault's whole deal in talking about disciplinary power. And this is something very important to factor into your own thinking and your own behavior on this issue, which is why I decided to get so wonky and subject myself to another round of people picking the fly shit out of the salt on tangents that do not matter. The core. To recap, the only way to free yourself from disciplinary power and punitive norms is to reject the idea of the norm. That is the only way to free yourself from any of this shit. And when enough of us do that, when enough of us start talking about typicalities, clear majorities, a majority is not a norm, a majority is a majority, right? A majority opinion can change a norm, but a majority in itself is not that thing that sorts, minority, majority is not the difference, is not normal, abnormal. Join me in typicality. Join me in majority, minority, typical, atypical, and reject the idea of norms. Because norms are mind worms. And that's our way out of this. This is the lone, super fast little ship with the protagonist of the sci-fi series with a big war going around them, pew 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 laser, and they're zipping around. It's like a crew of 3 or maybe 5, or pick the sci-fi ship of your choice. They all fall into that trope. That's it. That's the way out of this nonsense. And when enough of us do this so that we can have typicality, when we have a critical mass of, no, fuck you and your forced norms, sanity will return and we'll be able to have large-scale conversations about this stuff again without the normalization wars. Hopefully you found that an entertaining presentation of very dense content. If you did, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/Leanna K. Thanks for watching.